Anthem chapter 7 is one of the most important chapters in the book, at least as far as I'm concerned. It's definitely one of the ones that I marked up the most. So I hope that as you go back and do the discussion boards and look at these videos, if you weren't taking such good notes, that you start paying attention now, because it's really important. One of the first things I noticed about this chapter on the first page of the chapter is when, on the third kind of paragraph, he's talking to the World Council of Scholars, and he's walking into the building. He says, "We saw nothing as we entered save the sky and the great windows, blue and glowing. Then we saw the scholars who sat around a long table. They were as shapeless clouds huddled at the rise of the great sky. There were men whose famous names we knew, and others from distant lands whose names we had not heard. We saw a great painting on the wall over their heads of the 20 illustrious men who had invented the candle." One of the things that struck me about that particular section is the idea of 20 people that it took to invent a candle. Now, I recognize that many of the great inventions in the world take a lot of different minds to get through so that you can perfect the art. But a candle, I think we can both agree, is kind of a simple sort of invention. So you can imagine exactly how many people it would take then to invent something much more elaborate in their community if it was available. In fact, you see that a little later in the chapter, and we'll get to that in the next video. So what this brought to mind for me was the idea that when conformity is taken to a huge extreme, and particularly when that conformity is mandated by a government and not chosen by a people, then we end up with a lot of ignorance and a kind of sense of false safety and false security, because other people do the thinking for you. I know I've had friends who have gone on church trips or relief missions or service experiences to countries that were at one point communist, and have talked about how frustrating it can be to work with people who are used to having all their thoughts made up for them and have the government provide everything for them. It can be very, very difficult. Another story I can tell you is of some personal relatives of mine, some relatives who lived in East Germany, which after World War II was a place where they had a lot of communism and a lot of socialist government going around. Not a very happy or efficient place to live in. They told me a story of how when they wanted to get a car, people had to put their name in to get a car years before they actually got one, and that they would only come in one color, and it took, I think they said it took them 2 or 3 years before they were even able to have the car that they applied for. So the government, when it takes care of everything for you, becomes a really kind of inefficient place because they don't have anybody to answer to. It reminds me of a report I saw in the news recently where they were talking about airport security lines. Now, I'm sure all of you have been on an airplane or know somebody who has that you can ask about this, but waiting in an airport security line can be a really frustrating thing. I know I got to an airport an hour in advance before my flight recently and barely made my flight. I stood in line for over an hour. I would barely do that at Disneyland. So it can be a really inefficient place because it's run by a federal government, and who are they going to answer to? Everybody still needs what they do, so it's not like you can hire somebody better. Well, one airport did. There was an airport in California that hired an independent group to do their airport security screenings, and they are consistently the most efficient airport in the nation because that company has to stay good. They have to stay relevant. They talked about how the company would have all their employees practice going through luggage and to see what they could find, and the fastest and most efficient and most accurate groups would get prizes, or they just know that they have to be good, and consistently they're finding more damaging things in people's baggage that they don't want people taking on airplanes, and they're getting people through security lines faster because they know they have to be better or they'll lose their spot. So if there's anything that I learned as I read chapter 7 and as I started thinking about how that applied to my life, it was that, I think, at least for me, most of the time I agree that when government runs things and we don't have any other options, then sometimes that leads to a community where things can be super inefficient and not very helpful because there's nobody to answer to. Now, I'm not suggesting that all government things are bad. We definitely need government to take care of some things. But talk to your parents and think to yourself, what are the things that government takes care of that I want them to keep taking care of for me, that they do better than I can do myself? And what are some of the things that government wants to take care of that I think, I can probably do that better and do that better for myself than you can do that for me. So I'd rather do that without your help. So think to yourself, what do you want the government to do for you? And what would you prefer you do yourself? Because to be honest, I don't really need 20 illustrious men inventing candles for me. I can do that.